Hi everyone, welcome to this book discussion on Rated A, Soft Porn Cinema and Mediations of Desire in India by Darshana Sreedhar Mini. And I'm welcoming Darshana to Doing Sociology with a very quick introduction. She is an assistant professor at the Department of Communication Arts, University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's the author of the book Rated A, Soft Porn Cinema and Mediations of Desire in India, which we are going to be discussing today. And it's been published by UC Press 2024. And she's also the co-editor of South Asian Pornographies, Vernacular Formations of the Permissible and Obscene, which was published by Routledge in 2024. So Darshana, welcome to Doing Sociology and thank you for giving us the time today.
Thank you so much. This is awesome to be, giving a conversation around the book, and thank you so much for the invitation.
Right. So let me begin with this question about, why and in what context do you write the book?
So this is part of my dissertation, which actually spanned around 10 plus years of research. And this is the first book on pornography in India. So because of which there was no initial material I could rely on, I had to do a pilot study in 2010 just to see the viability of this project. Because, soft porn films were produced anonymously. No one really actually came up with the real credits in the credit sequence that you will see as a part of the films. And people did not know much about the production cultures around soft porn. So this whole veil of anonymity actually meant that unless and until do a pilot study, you wouldn't really get to know who are these people who are making these films, because there are a lot of sensational reports around soft porn production as an exploitative practice. So as a feminist who is interested in understanding precarious labor practices in entertainment sector, soft porn became a case study for me. So I went to Kodambakam in 2010, worked there as a dubbing artist, as a production assistant, and did some odd jobs and tried to actually get to know what does it mean to be waiting for work. Because most of the people who ended up making soft porn came from below the line labor force. They were, makeup artists. Some of them were production assistants. Some others were working as assistant directors for years on end, waiting for a break. So this project also evolved over years, right? I started in 2010. I was registered as a PhD student at JNU in 2011, and then I moved to the US. So this project also, evolved as I did more fieldwork, as I got to know stories of people who came to Kodambakam to make a career out of film, which didn't launch, and then they decided to do odd jobs. And this passion for cinema is what drives soft porn. So I use a kind of a feminist lens to understand precarious labor practices and transnational media circulation, which made soft porn itself a product of transmediation. Because many of these soft porn films drew initial influence from exploitation films that were imported from the US in the 1980s, triggering off indigenous film production practices in India. But soft porn was also exported to the Middle Eastern Gulf in the 1990s and early 2000s, where they're very popular among the blue-collar laborers from Kerala, and were screened in labor camps and circulated as DVDs. So there is a very interesting way in which soft porn mutates, transports itself, and peddles itself as like an object of desire.
Right, very interesting. And we also haven't had a discussion on pornography per se, from a sociological or an anthropological or even a media studies, perspective. So let me ask a little bit about your field site, if you could talk more about it, as well as the methods that you use.
Yeah, thank you, Rituparna. So one thing is that pornography, when I refer to this particular form as a pornography, they're not pornography in the sense of hardcore porn that you will see in the Western context, or explicit sex per se. None of the soft porn films had hardcore sex. The idea of soft was referring to the malleability of softness, which could include foreplay and erotic kind of song sequences and soundtrack and mourning, and the kind of simulation of sex, not real sex. And that's the kind of basic distinction the filmmakers were trying to basically tell, saying that we're not making porn, we are making films which have strong female leads. And soft porn films were also called women-centered cinema in the production circles because they had strong female characters who basically embraced their sexual desires and wanted to self-fashion their identities, had like desires around moving beyond their caste and class origins. So in my book, actually, I look at this figure as Madhaka Rani, as a very sexually autonomous figure who's using her sexuality and body as one way of bypassing the kind of constrained caste position that she was kind of contained in. In terms of field work, I think one of the things, like I mentioned earlier, is that soft porn has this kind of very dispersed kind of origin, like, drawing inspiration from American exploitation films. But these films were produced in Kodambakam, not in Kerala. So even though they're called Malayalam films, they were all produced in Kodambakam, which is a tinsel town in Chennai. So, and Chennai is the place where all the South Indian film industries had their initial days before each regional industry migrated to its base. So it's interesting that the low budget films still have their base in Kodambakam and Chennai. And that was a place which I initially visited in 2010 and did like frequent field works and worked in the industry. So one site was also like trying to understand how soft porn films are being made, since there is only like, reports which are very sensational about the exploitative practices. You need to know how these films are produced, because none of the filmmakers want to use their real names, right? The names are all made up. So if you are looking for this one particular director, you will know that it will end up in this kind of a circular pattern where you're trying to look for people who don't exist. But at the same time, the only person who kind of conjoins the pre-production, production, and post-production aspects of filmmaking was the production manager. So that's the key person who basically delivers the film print to the lab for processing. And I waited in the lab areas in Kodambakam, especially Prasad lab. And that's where I got to meet different agents who are, helping with the distribution, and people who are trying to basically cut a deal when it comes to marketing these films, and who make posters. So it's interesting that the field site itself became a very dispersed process in itself when you're trying to make those connections. These are fragmentary connections, and unless and until you're being introduced to these filmmakers by people who are trusted, no one will talk about it. So the process of doing this project was also very investigative. Like it made me really think about how do you connect these different fragments together. So Kodambakam was one field, and I also did field work in different B and C circuit cinema across different parts of India, which includes different theaters in Kerala, Chennai, Bombay, Kolkata. So it was interesting, and Delhi. So it was interesting to think about how these films are exhibited. What are the exhibition strategies used? What are the ways in which exhibitors and distributors are trying to, manage a profit, a profit deal? Because these were all basically had a 50-50% profit deal, which means that you're not losing anything. Neither is the exhibitor losing anything, nor the distributor, because soft porn films emerged out of a economy of survival, right? When the mainstream film industries were really in a very bad financial lull time in their kind of like box office returns, soft porn films became that one way of recouping the financial kind of stability, and because of which exhibitors and distributors have devised different ways and means in order to stay afloat. So that was another site for me in terms of locating what are the different ways through which these films are being marketed, how are these films being consumed, because soft porn films are also consumed by predominantly male patrons. So I was interested in talking to them and understanding the kind of transit population who come to these cinema halls. And many of these cinema halls are also located near bus stands and railway stations. So I'm also interested in understanding what made people spare 1.5 hours to come and sit there in the cinema, what were they expecting, and their prior experiences watching similar kinds of films, etc. The third site was Middle Eastern Gulf. So this is part of the multi-sided ethnography that I did. I also spent some amount of time in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, trying to talk to laborers, blue-collar laborers in labor camps, and other Malayalis in different kind of professional sectors, asking about their memories from the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s, because I was interested in also understanding how video became like this object of desire. Because erotic imagination, if you ask anyone who grew up in the 1980s, 1990s, would say that the VHS tapes was one way in which blue films entered India. via Southeast Asia and Dubai. So I was also trying to track how did this material enter India, the kind of illegal pirate underground circuits that operated, etc. So Dubai was another place that I did field work, and also like another set of things I did was also like trying to track down these actresses who were part of soft porn films, because as a feminist historiographical approach in looking at the formation of soft porn and media publics, it was important for me to understand who were these women. And interestingly, many of these women were aspirants who really wanted to enter mainstream film industry, and they were using soft porn as a stopgap arrangements in order to make the ends meet. And many of them said that this was part of our life and we don't regret it. It's just that we consider this to be part of our labor that ideally would have gone either into mainstream cinema or soft porn cinema. And they actually knew what they were getting into. I think nobody was looking of it as a morally dubious form, because they said that we were told what we were supposed to do. And there was no hidden kind of practices. We were told outright what it entails. So it's very interesting to know about these women, their career trajectories. And many of these soft porn actresses were not really from Kerala. They were all from neighboring states, and also, from Punjab and Maharashtra. So I was interested in understanding what made them come to Kodambakam. So in short, it's a multi-sided ethnography with more than 4 to 5 dispersed sites. And this project was conducted from 2010 to 2020.
Thank you for
Yeah.
that very detailed response. I think it makes the plot crystal clear. So could you also talk about your theoretical and then the conceptual frameworks that you have used in this book?
Yeah, thank you. So, one of the main things I wanted to look at is how do we think about pornography in the context of South Asia and specifically in India? Because, the broader discussions around pornography has always been conditioned by the framing of obscenity. The colonial baggage itself being one way of legally regulating media publics, and what gets presented as porn is also seen as transgressive. So I actually wanted to be in conversation with scholars who were working on feminist porn studies as a very emerging field in itself. We have a lot of scholars working on it. Mira Miller Young, who has a fantastic work on African American women who worked in porn industry, and what's the kind of thin line between respectability and desire for self-fashioning that they navigated, which was kind of the immediate line of kind of engagement with my work. Because one of the questions that came up over and over again was a question about respectability. First of all, doing a work on porn as an academic enterprise is a legitimate enough task in itself or not. And I'm sure that many of you who are listening also must be thinking of what is there in soft porn to work through as a PhD project or as 10 years of work. But this was a question that came up over and over again. And also as someone who's working on regional film industry, right? So many people who are working on Malayalam films were asking me, why do you want to again portray Malayalam cinema as a hub of soft porn? So there are also questions about respectability of what is the way through which you can present a form which has been mired in controversy. And also to present it in such a way that you are able to ethically, unpack different stakeholders who were part and parcel of this form. Because I consider soft porn to be a social form which had different stakeholders, and over a period of time it mutated, it changed. So looking at it from the kind of pro-censorship position does not serve my purpose. And as a feminist scholar wanting to understand the nuances around sexually explicit and adult media, for me a feminist pornographic scholarship and the way in which it has laid out the scene is important. So what I am aiming for is a critically kind of nuanced understanding of porn, where you give more options for people who might be sex workers, who might be people who really wanted to work in soft porn as an industry, who consider that to be, just like any other job, to be also accommodated and be acknowledged for the labor they did. So the labor became one way of engaging with the scholarship on feminist porn studies. And the second field my work intervenes is in the labor studies context, because talking about labor in the Indian entertainment sector, we don't have too many works looking at that. And for me, this is both embodied labor, right? And labor of extras, labor of dubbing artists, and labor of people who are invisible, the directors who completely erase the markers of them from these films, or film technicians who migrated from mainstream Malayalam cinema to soft porn in order to basically, make the ends meet when the industry had its kind of financial, bad phase. They also do not want to be acknowledged as part of soft porn. So there is an invisible labor on multiple counts, but there is a hierarchy of scale. And I was interested in understanding what below the line labor force means. And soft porn as a form, I would say that it emerged from this kind of a hierarchy, as a kind of opposition to the hierarchy that exists in film industry. Film industry is deeply hierarchical, and there is also a meritocratic, talent-driven argument that is posited about film industry, that if you are able to stay put and take on this idea of like waiting for the right time, you will make it. So soft porn industry is comprised of people who waited for long enough. I know of people who waited for 20 years, 25 years for a break. So for me, a labor studies perspective was important to understand and unpack how soft porn industry and the production cultures it worked with can be used as a case study to understand the broader, Indian film industry in general. The kind of, questions about gender, labor practices, contract, which sometimes is not spoken much about. So when the Hema Commission report came, it didn't surprise me, because many of the interviews I've had in 2011, 12, 13, it was kind of the recurrent trope of, how there are power lobbies, or for that matter, power brokers who make deals and who are the ones people gravitate towards, because everyone wants jobs. And to have jobs, you have to be like closer to people who can give you jobs. So labor studies became a very crucial part of my project. And the third theoretical intervention, or the field of study I engage with, is the transnational media. So when we talk about transnational media, sometimes it's about anything that crosses different nation states, or for that matter, the idea of anything that is part and parcel of media flows. But for me, this project was also a provocation to look at alternative transnational as a paradigm. So in this book, I look at both, pirated underground circulation of media practices, like soft porn, and how it's being kind of sent via carriers, or, encoding, decoding practices in terms of DVD and VHS tapes that were used by, people who basically send the master copy from Kerala to the Gulf to be decoded it by an expert there, and then they basically, had a mass production of these material in the Gulf. So it's interesting for me to think about transnational not as a kind of, conversation between material or people of two nation states, but where you can have conversation between one region and the other. For me, it was also like one way of bypassing the over dominance of nations on nationalism and transnationalism. So by looking at how, a very regional form like soft porn, which is produced in Kodambakam but known as Malayalam soft porn, is entering into Gulf via underground circuits, via vegetable vendors and consignments that are being sent to the Gulf, was one way of demystifying the fact that transnationalism can be also seen as informal, as things that are also trying to work under the radar and not really out there visible, like treaties between two nations. That is not just the only way of looking at transnationalism. And the last area that my project intervenes is also to look at the idea of media publics. How can we think of media publics as one way of understanding the continuities and disjunctures between different mediated forms, whether it's television, mass media, or for that matter, radio, there is this understanding of legitimacy. Who can lay out their claims before a public? What kind of public are we imagining? And that's where the idea of sensationalism, sensational journalism, gossips, rumors, all of which becomes important. So for me, it's that way of basically tapping into the mundane, everyday reality of the kind of media that we come across, whether it's yellow journalism or gossips, which build on fragmented narratives, which may not have any factual claims, but they have audience. So I wanted to look at this kind of transactional space created by different mediated forms. Sorry, I think I went a little over time.
No, that's completely okay. So, next question. How does soft porn films sort of, distinguish themselves from pornography, and what has been India's relationship with pornography?
So, what is interesting about soft porn is the kind of quasi-legal status that it has in India. So many of these films were produced with the same production apparatus as a mainstream cinema, including songs written by famous lyricists, sung by famous background singers, including Yeshudas and Chitra, and dubbed by prominent mainstream dubbing artists. So the production apparatus is just the same. What distinguishes soft porn from other films is the way, like I said earlier, about the idea and the way in which they give strong female leads, and both the narrative space and the way in which these films are publicized, because the film centers around the female lead. It's about her desires, her aspirations, and the way in which she's trying to chart a kind of a new journey for herself in realizing what she wants. And the male characters do not really have much space in the narrative. And that's why, when I was interviewing many male actors who were part of soft porn, they were like, we're embarrassed. We don't want to be part of this. And they considered this to be emasculating, and which was very interesting, that there is a masculinity and its crisis that many actors felt that their own participation with the soft porn made them feel. And also their careers were kind of like completely closed and sealed after being part of these films. On the other hand, soft porn films were basically marketing women as the mascot of these films, because many of these films were, like some of these films, they call Shakila films, whichever films Shakila was acted in. But there were a lot of other starlets who were part and parcel of these films. So, unlike hardcore pornography, soft porn filmmakers were consistently putting forth a narrative that they are not making hardcore. And that's why, whenever I spoke with people, they were like, don't call it porn, call it soft porn. And one of the people actually wrote it down for me, soft dash porn. So I was curious, why dash porn? And he asked me to basically, hold on to, there was a bed sheet. I was sitting on a bed, and he was like, can you just hold on to that bed sheet and just feel for you what this means? And I was like, it's kind of soft. Yeah, that's the feeling we want to have. We don't want them to have hardcore sex. We want them to understand that soft porn films are not mainstream cinema. So they were trying to make like a product distinction, that soft porn films are made under, a lot of restricted conditions, including having the films to be certified by the Central Board of Film Certification. So CBFC want all the film scripts to be submitted before they are given the certification. So soft porn also came up with what is called Randam Ezhuthukar, second writers, who will basically go through the film script and cleanse it for any kind of so-called impurities. So it was interesting that the machinery of soft porn also came up with their own ways of making do economy, where they know that they are, against the normal understanding of what counts as a conventional film narrative meant for entertainment. And so they had their own kind of backup process in place. And you would be surprised to know that soft porn films, many of them were genrically categorized as melodramas and thrillers. And this is from the censor board, documents. So it was interesting that there's a kind of a relationship that soft porn films were trying to cultivate with mainstream, saying that these are not very different from mainstream, but these are not mainstream. And the immediate precursor to soft porn films were glamour films made by people like K.S. Gopalakrishnan, Chandrakumar, and others, which came in 1980s. And these films were like a cottage industry. K.S. Gopalakrishnan ended up making, let's say, around 24 to 30 films a year, which means that, there were a lot of mass production that were happening. And Gopalakrishnan also had like a specific cast and crew he worked with. So this was also like from the labor perspective, it's like a studio system where you have like, if you have a project, you're going to call this specific people for as cast and crew. So I think there is a continuation between the glamour cinema wave and soft porn, and soft porn filmmakers were quite aware of it. So A.T. Joy, who is one of the very few filmmakers who have used his own real name for making films, was K.S. Gopalakrishnan's, the person who basically took photographs for him. So there is a continuation in that wave. And India's relationship, the way in which the government and the regulatory structure looked at porn was as something that is delegitimizing film industry in general. So if you look at all the newspaper cuttings in the National Film Archives of India Library, or for that matter, any of the newspaper reports from 1980s and 90s, you will see that the film organizations are up in arms against soft porn, saying that soft porn is delegitimizing the labor that goes into it, and it's a hub of exploitation. So there is a pro-censorship position that you will see recurring from the industry's point of view. And again, this also ties up with questions about piracy. So soft porn films are also, promoting piracy, and they are also kind of allowing for informality to exist in film industry. So this is another kind of recurrent narrative that you will see in film journalistic discourse. But one thing to keep in mind is that, film industry has always been informal. And the informality has been the norm that the film industry has used to bypass conversations around labor. Even when the trade unions are putting forth the fact that you need to have contractual obligations and other things, safety, etc., the argument has been that it has been informal, and within the range of informality, we have been able to do this. So it was interesting that, in order to basically attack soft porn and soft porn filmmaking, the informality argument has been used by film industry at multiple times. And the second thing to keep in mind is that soft porn was not just seen as something that is Malayalam cinema centric. It was also seen as anything that comes out of South India. So there was a kind of a regional specificity that was given to soft porn, so much so that these films are even known in distribution circuits in Eastern India, like Kolkata, and in Western India as Madrasi films. They're called Madrasi films, and there's a package called Madrasi package where soft porn films, a bunch of them are clubbed together and distributed by people as Madrasi films. So when I went for fieldwork in Pradeep Cinema in Kolkata in 2017, they were like, you meant we don't have Malayalam soft porn, but we have Madrasi films. So I am also interested in this project to look at how a region gets tagged and attacked for being the hub of soft porn production and low budget films. Soft porn films were also dubbed into different languages. So sometimes you might not be able to understand which is the original language because they were dubbed simultaneously into multiple languages, including Hindi, Sinhala, Bengali, Tamil, Telugu. Because of which women's organizations were up in arms against soft porn films, saying that they are retitling the films, and sometimes the retitling of films might help them move beyond the radar of being scrutinized. And so it's interesting that there were a lot of stakeholders who were demanding that soft porn culture has to be completely erased for mainstream industry to regain its legitimacy.
Right, interesting. So you're talking about the men and masculinity. So how do these young men sort of relate to soft porn films? And a related question, of course, soft porn films will also be seen as representations of the obscene, no matter what people say that they're trying to only have soft love, or maybe what we see as puppy love. There's a new phrase to describe it instead of the hardcore physical intercourse. So do these films become these sites where debates of obscene representation often take place? And what about the men, if you could just elaborate a little more?
Yeah, so the book doesn't go in depth into the interviews I've had with men, primarily because of the scope of the project and all of that. I have a separate article that's coming out. But one thing to keep in mind is that the whole project started when I interviewed teenagers in early 2000s, asking them about sex education, like where did you get sex education, where have you heard about sex education in the context of your school, etc. And it was a focus group, and I was like, asking them, and they were like, Chichi, because I was like older to them. It's like, Chichi, why don't you just give us a piece of paper? We can write down, that might make it easier for us to have like a conversation. I was like, okay, let's do that. And then came Tundupadam, and then somebody said that Shakila films and soft porn films were one way of us understanding sex education, which was very interesting for me. Because soft porn films, there were also soft porn films which were certified as sex education films, but I was curious to know what is sex education, what is understanding of sex education that these teenagers got out of soft porn. And that's when they told me about condom. They were like, in soft porn films, there were condom in the mise-en-scène. And the condom, which was interesting because they didn't have to show us condom, but they didn't want to show us sex either. But they referred to the condom as one way of safe sex practices. And you also like see this woman being asked, and it's the woman's decision whether she want to initiate it to another level, which made them feel that there is this idea of consent, which was somewhere around the corner. But this is not the same for all the films. There were films where, filmmakers have really thought through how to incorporate sex education or the idea of consent into it. But the second question is also about this idea of having a conversation around sexuality, sexual desire in general. In a very conservative moral ethos like what we have in India, this conversation never happens. Of course, among girls or women or men, you might have like a homosocial space where you discuss these things. But to have like this conversation with a person from the opposite sex is still considered to be not, appropriate in multiple quarters. So for many of my respondents, soft porn actress was a figure of fantasy, a person whom you would never really have in your life, either as your lover or as your partner. But this is a zone of fantasy which you can never actually materialize. So that element of fantasy is there. And again, soft porn films also had like buxom figured women. And some of these films were also called auntie films because there are desires of younger men to have relationship with relatively older women. So all of which made this conversation around what does it mean to have desire, talk about it, and the films which shows those desires as as kind of happening in day-to-day lives, not as something which is beyond the realm of family. And many men said that like there is something about these films not trying to typify a family. Family is self-chosen as opposed to the family you're born into. So it's interesting that alongside the idea of like a very independent woman who is totally in control over her sexuality, who is not only wanting to be that wife figure, wanting to have a stable family, but who is also like very career oriented, that really attracted many men to this figure of soft porn actress, whom I call in my book as Madhagarani. But the second thing is that many of these men were also trying to, move away from the idea of stable family as the only way of trying to understand what they want. So many of them were married, and some of them are also like, youngsters in their soft porn cinema theater itself became a homosocial space where mostly you don't have any women attending it, except for a few places where I went, and we had a few sex workers, and that was it. But mostly they are all male spaces. So there is also this idea of going for something that was presumed to be transgressive, and the whole excitement that comes out of it, which was visible in the narratives that many men shared with me about college students going for late night shows, taking one or two buses, or people kind of figuring out this one particular film where they're going to book the whole cinema hall for one particular college student. So it's interesting that it's part of the nostalgia of growing up for many of my respondents, because also keep in mind, soft porn comes at the fag end of the celluloid phase before films are turning into digital. And soft porn films also had what was called tunde, or cut pieces, sexually explicit bits that are added into the film reel by the projectionist during the exhibition, which cannot happen in a digital format exhibition, right? So everyone is nostalgic about 1990s or growing up phase or their adolescence, and the celluloid era is associated with soft porn. So I have an article around a film called Kanyaga Talkies, which actually is about a soft porn theater, which is converted into a church, and what happens to the priest who comes to give the service, and he's haunted by this, soft porn actresses and starlets whose presence was very much visible in the theater space, which was converted to church. So it's interesting that the idea of spatial imaginations and fantasies are relegated to the cinema halls which were screening these films. And many of these cinema halls are B and C circuit cinema halls. They are not mainstream A circuit cinema halls, because B and C circuit cinema halls, which are, which do not have the same amenities as A, primarily because, they don't have the money to pay advance for films which are new releases. So after the films finishes their A circuit run, they come to B and C. So for soft porn audience, they did not have to wait for the film to finish its run in A before it comes to B and C. Soft porn films were released in all the circuits at the same go. So that also added to this idea of soft porn, the people who are in the provincial areas, in the mohalla areas, feeling that they are on par with the metropolitan audience because they get soft porn films immediately the moment they are released. So there is a very interesting class and idea of mass audience that emerges in discussing about who constitutes soft porn audience. I do not want to subscribe to the fact that low class and low quality is associated with soft porn, which is seen in a lot of writings and sensational reports, because it's also coming with a sense of entitlement that people who are interested in art cinema or who are self-reflexive cinephiles who will go into a circuit cinema and watch the film with this kind of seriousness, which is not seen in soft porn audience. I think the way soft porn film is designed and the way the soft porn audience engaged with the film is with the full knowledge that these films are made under a restricted set of circumstances. They might have continuity errors. They might have, like issues with the film reel. They might have to wait for the projectionists to insert the bits or cut pieces or thunder. And they were waiting for that. So there's a sense of anticipation that I saw in the audience, waiting for the cut piece to come, because they know it could come at any point. And these films are relatively shorter. They're not 2.5 hours long. They're just 1.5 hours long. And there are different deals between the person running the tea shop and the projectionist on exactly when the cut piece should appear, because after the cut piece, the interest of the audience in terms of having to stay for the whole film may not last for long.
Yeah, that's very interesting, in fact. And I wanted to ask a question about the professional aspirations of the lower rungs of people in the production units and how they see soft porn as offering a space for maybe sexual representation and shifting gender relationships. Did you observe anything?
I think one of the humbling experiences I had doing this work was to, get to know people who had lots of dreams, came to the industry and couldn't get anywhere, right? So they are talking about their failures to me. And when I started the project, I had to wait for a lot of time in terms of connecting with the people, because it's not like, you have a data set you work with. These are people with their own kind of lives and aspirations and desires. And for them to even know that this is a project where you are interested in hearing their stories. It's not like a kind of an article you would write and move on. For me, this project stood with me for almost 15 years. And so getting to know these people was very important. And that's where I would say that an ethical feminist approach was important for me as a methodology to start with, understanding that, they're not data sets. They're not people who will be giving me interviews. I will have to open myself up as much as I want them to talk about their lives. So I would say that the kind of conversation started only when some of them felt that I was working in the industry, I was biding time, and my project about writing something about soft porn might not really materialize unless and until they connect me with the rest of the people whom they knew. So trust-based relationships was what film industry, at least soft porn industry, was trying to promote. And for them, it was important that you're being introduced by someone who knows you and who knows me, and who will vouch for the very fact that, I'm a genuine person and that I'm interested in hearing their version of the story. Because I think people are really tired of stories of, I have recovered your story and now I'm going to actually bring you to the limelight. That kind of narrative many of my respondents did not want. So when I started, trying to understand where they come from, many of them had completely left the industry. Some of them are still around, and they are in different parts. So I sometimes go to their houses when they invite me home, and these are people with their families and kids, and who sometimes do not feel comfortable talking about their stint in soft porn, and over a period of time when they opened up, one of the things they said was that we could have been working in film industry doing the same repetitive job over and over again as makeup artist, as production assistant. But what really what really made us make this leap by making soft porn films was the fact that we want to make creative decisions. We wanted to be part of the making. We want to write script. We wanted to see how it's being executed. That was nearly next to impossible. And soft porn films also allowed for a different kind of pooling of resources. Like many of these films were also made by people who are in the Gulf, who were financing the films, but they never made films in their names. They're production managers, or they just had like made up names. And they had also production houses, which were which kind of lasted only for, let's say, 8 to 9 months till the production was over and then wound up. So it was interesting for many of my respondents to also see what really, really drove their passion and aspiration to make these films. And it was very heartening to know that for them, it was like, we do not want to do just makeup anymore. We do not want to just be a production assistant or, getting hold of, food and arranging stuff. And we want to make these films. And for them, they had clear idea of why these films were important for them. I'm not saying that all soft porn films had feminist orientation, but at least many of the people whom I spoke with were very ethical in terms of what they are comfortable sharing. Because there was an actress whom many of my respondents knew, and I wanted to connect with her, and they waited for a very long time for her to respond. And when she responded, she was like, I would not want to meet the researcher. I can speak to her over phone, and not on her phone, but I can call in one of your phones and speak to her. So it was interesting that there was this idea of what they were comfortable sharing that was important. And soft porn industry in itself emerged because of this hierarchies of scale, and there is a kind of solidarity that bound them together. The very fact that we are in this together, we are making something which is not seen as conventional in the film circuits, and hence we need to put ourselves together. So there were continuity albums that I had access to, and some of these continuity albums were one place where I got to know some of these actresses and the production crew, and who were the rest of the actors whose shots probably might not have ended in the final cut. So and again, when I'm talking with them about the material, because many of the materials that ended up in my project are also from personal archives. None of the material which I work with, including the film prints, enter traditional places like the National Film Archives of India, because these are not seen as valid enough material to study film research. So I also had to tap into personal collectors. Many of them were willing to share the material and showcase me the different aspects of it, because some of the times, when you're doing research, it is not always about archival in terms of materials which are in the archives or have that archival value. It's also about much more in terms of focus group interviews. And for me, this materials that I found with scrap dealers or with personal collectors assumed a new value. So if you look at my book, you will see that there is paper cuttings of soft porn film advertising by a collector called Sharat Chandran, who had collected it meticulously, all the soft porn films in terms of when they were released and its publicity over different media platforms, like different newspapers, both in Malayalam and in Tamil. So there is a very interesting archival process that people do. And I also wanted to open the canvas of methodology in order to tap into it. And for me, that was one way of opening the hierarchies of scale when it comes to knowledge production, that we cannot prioritize one over the other. And like I mentioned earlier, for me, a sociological lens was important, because this project could not have just had one methodology. It had to tap into people's memories and their experiences and idea of failure. And I still remember one of the respondents told me that a project like this will not succeed if you're looking at ledgers and archives. You have to yourself experience what failure looks like. My failure is not in any way compared a comparison to what they have gone through, but I think what probably have connected them with me was this idea of waiting for something to turn up and staying in Kodambakkam for over months, which made my respondents think that there is something out there that they might be able to fill in.
Right. So the next question is about, what are media publics? Because you
Yeah.
talk about it, and how have soft porn films shaped these media publics in India? And there's also another question attached to it, which is about, this term that you use, scandal publics. How do these overlap with media publics?
Thank you. So one thing, when I was thinking about this project, I was looking at what is that one thing that ties up all of my inquiries and, the kind of interview material and the material that I've collected together. And that was the idea of media publics. Media publics, I consider that to be an assemblage of infrastructure, audience, and meaning-making apparatus that is conditioning certain discourses around who can legitimately put their claim before others, right? The idea of public. We're not here thinking about a rational subject engaging in a public deliberation, but we're thinking about publics as something which is evolving. But again, not everyone is permitted equal entry or equal status when you wanted to put forth your legitimate concerns. For instance, soft porn filmmakers, when they wanted to make films, they were already bracketed out as people who are not really interested in filmmaking as a creative enterprise, but as someone who are interested in quick money or interested in wanting to exploit women. So that's the thing I wanted to complicate a little bit. And for me, this idea of meaning-making apparatus is important. The apparatus of soft porn is not just about production. It is about exhibition. It is about the discourses around soft porn, the lineage of soft porn from glamour cinema. And in one of my chapters, the first chapter, I look at obituary columns of women who were looked down as Madhakarani, including Silk Smita, Vijayashree, and Rani Padmini. What happens to the death reports? How do film journals write about the death of these actresses? And I see this idea of a forensic gaze whereby the kind of circumstances under which they died, the number of wounds in their body. For instance, Rani Padmini was murdered along with her mother. And their sexual lives and aspirations are basically kind of broken down like as if it is a first investigation report filed by the investigation desk of the police. So it's interesting that you will see this kind of a sexual excess and the urge to contain it emerging in the film journalistic discourse around Madhakarani. So I thought that to be atypical. You will not do that with Raj Kapoor, or you will not do that with a mainstream actor, but you have the legitimacy to do that with a actress who might be sexually candid, who might have had like a colorful life, only because you think that one, she is dead, two, she doesn't have a family who might come up with a defamation suit, and three, by the very fact that she acted in certain films, basically means that you are basically putting her inferior as opposed to other actresses. One thing which Silk Smita said over and over again, that she was just being reduced to being a dancer, and that too inferior to the other artists and main leading female figures who were in the set. So it's important for us to think about those hierarchies in place as well. And the second thing to keep in mind is also the kind of cross-pollination of ideas between newspapers, internet, cinema, mass cultural forms that is made possible in this media publics when you are legitimately putting forth these ideas. So I was interested in relationships, formations, and exchanges that media facilitates. And how does this contribute to the everyday understanding of what counts as news? Worth reporting, worth reading. And I was also looking at yellow journalism quite a lot. So there were yellow journalistic kind of magazines I was subscribing to understand, because many of these magazines were also using gossips, speculation to thread, news stories, because these stories do not end. They just leave one particular fragment left hanging, which they're expecting the readers would contribute to. And the same thing you will see in social media, like the comments that come below certain posts, which is working with the same kind of logic, that there is a kind of an unending circuit of information which is trying to fill in through speculation and gossip and rumor, where certain bodies, certain people, and who are these people whose bodies, whose lives are being dissected. And that became important for me. And that's where I thought media publics could be a broader framework for us to understand how certain women, and especially women from a low caste, low class background in a heavily misogynistic society in India, they are the ones who are primarily targeted, sexual minorities. So it's important for us to understand the primal role of media and their kind of accountability, lack of accountability thereof, in terms of claiming responsibility of what comes as an aftermath to death. So that became important for me as like an entry point to conceptually weave together why we need to think about soft porn not just as a new genre, not just as a production industry, but as a case study that will make us understand and look at mediated forms, broadly speaking.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Darshana, for this very engaging and interesting conversation. I think we get a sense of the book in terms of what it intends to do, the methods, the theories, the concepts, and of course, the depths of your research. So thank you once again for this conversation.
Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you. Thank you.